All right, so if you can get through that, get through section 4, the rest of it's pretty much smooth sailing. Section 4 is the hardest one. I kind of wrap your head around. Work at it if it's not clear yet. It's not so hard. It's basically, again, just recognizing certain limitations on what we actually perceive. It's a question, as it was with Berkeley in a different way, what's really going on in our experience, here with a focus on cause and effect relations, and just saying, yes, the direct experience is not there. Nonetheless, we need to form expectations in order to get by in life and so on. We do it through inductive inference. And that's just going to have those kinds of issues that we were talking about before. But basically, what he wants to do here is just fill in a little gap, basically. I mean, he starts out with just some general things, just trying. Remember, back in the day, people's view of skepticism was overwhelmingly negative. So Hume has a bit of an uphill battle. He's just trying to say, that's not really fair. It's actually a better way to go. It's actually more in line, frankly, with taking a scientific approach. So anyway, he's just trying to prepare his readers. For us today, that's not such a big issue. But basically then, he just wants to say, well, if we do take that sort of approach to what we're talking about and say, well, what really is going on? Quite simply, and he's more or less already let this cat out of the bag, is, well, there's some kind of habituation, right? Or we grow accustomed, right? We get used to certain patterns and we form expectations accordingly. So all he's really doing here is basically saying, well, I think that is basically a built-in principle, right? Something that's basically built into our very nature, that we do this, right? That we habitually go from the experience of certain patterns of constant conjunction to forming the expectation of a certain thing to come, basically. And again, as always, he thinks this is incredibly important and useful for us to do. It's a wonderful thing, right? It's just that at the same time, it's not so sort of purely logical or rational as we might have thought, right? This is how we get by. Nowadays, we would probably be inclined to say that it clearly has some sort of what am I trying to say? Some kind of survival value from the evolutionary perspective, basically, right? And it will apply to other kinds of species as well. We'll get to that in just a second. But basically, he just kind of describes what he thinks, right? We form a belief, right, based on our experience. And he just wants to put it this way, right? It just comes from the associations, the patterns, and so on, and nothing more, right? So again, it's not the case that, well, this is going on, but there's also some kind of direct insight that would actually be the basis for scientific claims. You say, no, this applies to everybody. It applies to us in our ordinary lives. It applies just the same, even in scientific practice. So that's the kind of thing that can get the hackles of scientists up, possibly. But anyway, that's basically the main upshot of what Hume is saying here, is that empirical reasoning, whether in its kind of ordinary everyday usage or at the level of science, is always based upon a certain unprovable assumption. And the fact that it goes on, he'll say, well, it's just part of our nature to go about thinking about things in this way because it's so, eminently useful to do it that way. It works very well. So he goes on and describes a little bit more. Most of this is fairly straightforward. He's just kind of describing things. The more you experience a pattern, the stronger the belief, the stronger the feeling, right? But check out the word at the bottom here. He even calls it a kind of instinct. That can really offend some people who think very highly of their rational faculties and so on. But basically, that's is what he's trying to say. Just a feature of our nature, kind of built in, hardwired, if you like, which does not distinguish us in any essential way from non-human animals, or at least quite a number of them. Because if you got pets or you know anything about animals, of course, they do exactly the same thing. They experience certain patterns and come to form certain expectations, and it's very useful for them in their lives to do precisely that. So basically, Hume is saying, yeah, that's basically what goes on with us too. Anyway, so that was the end. Sorry, that was the end of section 5, basically there. So it's fairly simple. He's basically just saying there is this kind of principle built into us so that when we're thinking about human reason, as we might do from time to time, and thinking that empirical reason is sort of the highest form of that, which is again a very common thing to think in the modern times, Hume's point is basically, that doesn't provide its own foundation. There is something upon which it rests, and that is something like this, a kind of instinct or just some sort of principle of habit or of custom, the way he puts it, right? That really is what empirical reason rests upon. So that's just another way of kind of expressing the basic point from section 4. There's always an assumption, right? Something that's sort of like pre-rational or sub-rational upon which empirical reasoning rests, and it has to be that way, right? When you take that out of the picture, there just is no more empirical reasoning. It would just never make any sense to go about thinking about things in that way. So anyway, quickly then in section 7, he goes a little bit further. When he's talking about necessary connection, that just means a cause, right? A cause, when something causes something. Right? So it's a very common idea, right? When we think necessary connection, that sense of metaphysical necessity. But he does say, we don't have a very clear idea of this, kind of the way we were talking once about matter, right? He just applies the test. Remember that test from section 2, this test for meaningfulness? Is there an impression of necessary connection, of two things being connected necessarily? And he's going to say, no, I don't think there is, right? It's an idea we have, but it doesn't quite make sense in the way we might think, because it doesn't come from any experience, whether it's between objects or bodies, whether it's between our mind and our own body, basically, or even within our mind as far as ideas are concerned. He thinks we never have the experience that things couldn't have possibly been different, right? That would be what necessary connection amounts to, that something else could not possibly have happened. He thinks we never have an experience like that, basically. And anyway, that's going to basically, relate back and is in effect, to at least an extent, a different way of expressing his point about constant conjunction, right? That we never directly perceive the actual causing of something, right? That we only see it, say, from a distance or more superficially when we see a pattern across time in different cases, basically. So, he's just going to go on then and say, well, what do we mean then when we're talking about cause? What could we possibly mean when we take into account what he's now told us? He tries out a couple of ways here, basically, as you'll see. They're very similar, but he settles on one. It's the second thing from the bottom here. An event followed by another, for the appearance of the former always conveys the thought to the latter. Seems a little awkward the way he's phrased it, but anyways, he's basically just expressing that, this is what cause means for us, and we take into account these skeptical observations that he's made about what is actually going on. So the significance here is really quite something. You may not see it right away, but the idea is, usually we think about the idea of cause as being very metaphysically significant, being like the very glue, so to speak, that holds the world together. This is how reality works. It's something intrinsic to reality itself. But Hume is saying here, well, that's not exactly right. When we talk about cause, it's actually it has more to do with our experience, right? It's more, as I put here, a feature of our psychology, how we make sense of things, right? Now, we all may believe deep down in our hearts that there's something like cause in reality itself, and that's why we experience things in the way that we do, but we have no direct awareness of that. For us, when we talk about how things are connected in that necessary sort of way through a causal connection, basically, really this is just saying something about the manner in which we happen to experience things. It may also apply to many non-human animals. It may or may not apply to any, say, extraterrestrials we may encounter one day. There may be creatures on some far-off galaxy who perceive reality much, much better than we do. Maybe they can see right into the inner workings of things and know immediately how causation works, right? They would have a very different understanding of cause and of reality than we do. But who cares? We're only concerned about us, basically. And Hume is saying, it's just a very important observation to make that when we're talking about cause, this is entirely a reflection of how we are experiencing and making sense of things rather than just some direct reflection of how things actually are in and of themselves. So part of the significance there is that if different people did realize this and really take this to heart, then they're just going to go about things differently. They're not going to be, like Dolbach, for example, so overconfident in the way they perceive and the conclusions that they draw. They're just going to be more, skeptical, a little more cautious. They're not going to be so self-assured. They're going to be open to other considerations, prepared to be wrong, prepared for the need to revise their views, and so on. And for Hume, he thinks that's all really good, basically. The chances that we're going to start agreeing about the facts of the world around us goes way, way up, he thinks. Remember, he thinks the main problem, the main source of disagreement is when people overstep the limits, right? There's certain limits to what we can really say reliably on an empirical basis. He's just saying here, let's just take that into account. And if we do that, and if everybody did do that, then the chances that we're going to agree are going to go way up, and we're just going to have to, as long as we can, recognize that, the scope of our knowledge and so on is a little bit retracted. It's a little bit retrenched, right? It's a little bit less, but so what? It's okay. It's still pretty good. It's like the weather, basically. That's why that's a good example. It's not perfect, but it's still very useful, and there's always lots of room for improvement.